And joining us at exactly the right moment to comment on that and other things that have been going on is political and social and media commentator Hilary Calvert. Hilary, welcome to the show this afternoon. Have you ever heard anything so, well, I guess you have heard of lots of things that are just as absurd, but it gives you a good indication of where we're going, doesn't it, really?
Yes, and we're spoiled for choice about things to comment on, really, at the moment. But that health, it's just sort of, if we just got rid of anybody mentioning what race we are, that would be good. If no one was allowed to do anything based on race, really, I would be happier. It's just ridiculous. And it would be ridiculous, that one, whether or not it was a Maori health provider. But the idea of private health insurance, because you can't trust your own people to be... I don't know where to start. Anyway, how about we can talk about, for a moment, emergency housing tenants, which is another sort of really weird.
Well, this is something that's new to me, can I just say. I didn't really realise that there was... Okay. When I was a mayor, and we lived in Wanganui, which isn't the most upmarket place in the world, let's be honest about it. I think the three most deprived district health boards were, in terms of dealing with deprived communities, as they were defined, were Northland, the East Coast, Tairāwhiti and Wanganui. All right? So that'll give you some indication that we were down there or up there, depending on which way you look at it, in terms of need. But even then, the number of people who were needing housing, emergency housing in a deprived area, and I can remember sitting on both the District Health Board, Hilary, and I, as Mayor, probably on two hands, all right? And they were generally looked after by the agencies, so Salvation Army or, the Baptists or,
even the Presbyterians.
Yeah, there was a simple service available. And if there was anybody on the streets, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the police would generally, or somebody would come and pick them up, scoop them up and take them off there, and hey, lo, there was no one on the streets. Now suddenly, over the last 5-6 years, I'm not just blaming Labor for this, but I'm just saying it seems coincidental, there's been this proliferation of people who need emergency housing, and I'm going, how did that happen? Why? Can you explain that to me?
Well, I think when they say emergency housing, and I see here that there are 24,717 applicants on the wait list, and that's apart from the...
so is that on the Takangaroa or whatever it is, New Zealand housing wait list?
State houses, demand for state houses, 24,717 people. So I don't know where they're living. I mean, like in Dunedin recently, there's been a thing about housing for people who are the bottom rungs and things, and they say these people who are homeless are living in these dreadful housing places, and I'm thinking they're not homeless. They're not in good homes, but
there aren't 24,000 people on the street.
In emergency houses, so I don't know where they're all living. So I presume they're living in places that, although they're houses, they don't qualify, or they're couch surfing, as they would say if it was a student or something. But
they're living in someone's garage or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but
on top of that,
carry on.
These people
sorry, just before you carry on, Hilary, but of that 24,000, how many of them are living in private accommodation? So they're renting, but they want a state house because they're poor. Because I know that I've only got to pay 25% of whatever my income is, whether it's state or private. I'm working or I'm on a benefit. I've only got to pay 25%. It makes much more sense for me to be in a state house from an economic and financial point of view than paying rent, yeah?
But it's even better than that, because once you're in a state house, once you're in emergency housing, apparently you're supposed to pay rent, which is called an emergency housing contribution, 25% of your income. But recently, RNZ, I think it is, found out that there's $60 million unpaid by these tenants. Only $17 million has been paid. So this is 3/4 of them aren't paying.
At all?
At all. So wouldn't you want to live in an emergency housing place if you didn't have to pay anything?
Would, because my emergency housing...
You're on benefit already.
Well, because in many of the cases, the emergency housing is a motel unit.
Yes, and so here you are in this motel unit, and you're one of the few people, so there's 3,000 of them or something, and how many? 3,978 adults and 3,500 children, so 7,500. So a quarter of the people who would want to be in emergency housing are in emergency housing, and those lucky people don't have to pay any rent, despite the fact that the money comes from...
the state.
For the most part, the state. So they have given the money to not pay 25% of it to the state. And two things I think are very weird about this. One of them is Christopher Hipkins says, when somebody says what happens to them when they don't pay their bills, he says, look, that's a process we work through. We have a debt to government process, he says. Now, I'd like to put my taxes into that process. So if I owe taxes, could I have it in the debt to government process? Because apparently you don't have to pay them once they go into that process. So that's just beyond weird. And on top of that, we've got the Greens who say, when people aren't able to afford to put Kai on the table, they can't meet the cost of emergency housing. So what they're suggesting is that you don't chase them. It isn't fair to make them pay 25% of what you've already given them to pay their rent, because that's part of the reason you've got the benefit, to pay your rent. And you shouldn't have to pay it. Now, those things, nobody's saying to the Greens, have you costed the policy? Let's say all these people, because you want to give them housing, you've said that's your policy to give them all housing. So here's 30,000 people who, and it'll be a whole lot more once they don't have to pay anything, who you are going to give housing, and then they're not going to have to pay anything. So you give them benefit, and then they don't have to pay anything for their housing. Greens should have to cost that. Why isn't anybody saying, these loopy policies you come up with, Greens, why don't you have to cost them when you're proposing them? They don't cost anything. Nobody asks the Greens the cost of any of their loopy policies. Why is that?
Because the media are biased. That can only be the only answer, can't it? I mean, why wouldn't you ask
it's as if they don't,
the same questions?
Money doesn't count for a Green. That the cost of something, the benefit is an ephemeral, good for the planet sort of thing, and the detriment is we don't cost it. It's sort of like somehow they're out of the balanced books and things. So how can you take them seriously? But why would you vote for them? Especially where they could end up being in cabinet or something, like they are at the moment. Luckily, Labor doesn't give them anything. They just give them the baubles, as it were, of office without actually doing anything much. But there's a lot of people who vote for the Greens, and they must have to vote for people who they have no idea live in the financial reality that the people who vote for them live in.
Well, it's our money at the end of the day, and it's being routinely, literally pissed against a wall somewhere.
Yeah.
Listen...
But no one's chasing it.
No.
It's
and
the
so,
government who's not chasing them.
No,
you
that's
can't
right.
blame them for not paying it if they're not going to be chased for it. I mean, that's smart.
Well, but the thing that strikes me, wait on, I mean, and everybody at home will be asking the same question at the moment. Well, why don't you just simply garnish their thing? So you would withdraw the housing costs from the welfare benefit that you're paying them. So facto, you won't have a debt.
Yeah, and if you, because they can.
Of course they can.
Give them less, effectively. And is the same argument out there for if they get fined by the court? So they get fined by the court, or they have a liable parent contribution for their children. And the Greens, I presume, because they pretend to be principled, would say, well, the same principle would apply. They've got no money, so they shouldn't have to pay for their children. They shouldn't have to pay fines from the courts. So why should they pay anything?
Well, listen, the answer to that is they don't.